Okay. So, okay, as I said, what I want to talk about in the second half here is this idea of metaphor. And I'm going to raise a bunch of different issues and questions. Some of them were talked about in the camp paper. Some of them are only gestured at in the camp paper, but they're useful kind of questions to think about, just generally on the nature of metaphor, the kind of content that metaphors might have, if they have any. Notably, this question, the big question we had about the kind of limits of expressibility, as I said, a version of it's going to come back here too. So let's start off by just the general, most broad thing, right? Metaphor is a figurative rather than literal use of words. It typically involves a kind of transfer. In fact, this is actually where the word is from. It's from the Greek for transfer. It's a transfer of something like a description or quality to something that's analogous to our original applicant, right? So, easy one. Again, we're going to use this as our running example. Juliet is the sun. Right? This is a paradigmatic metaphor. Note, there's a similar kind of notion here. People, are you guys familiar with similes? Right. So a simile is basically just like a metaphor, except you use the word like. So Juliet is like the sun would be a simile. The interesting thing is that metaphors tend to just be given. Similes tend to be given as an opening to describe what the similarity is. So I would say Juliet is like the sun, and then the follow-up would be, in which ways?
She's very happy.
Yes, she's so dense. She's full of flaming gas, like whatever you want. Yeah, you can see how this goes. Yeah.
But is this then personal, or is this the real meaning of the metaphor Juliet is like the sun?
Good. So importantly, right, we haven't really said anything yet about what the meaning of this is. This is just kind of getting clear what our target topic is. Right? And again, there's this general thing of transfer where you're transferring some qualities from, in this case, the sun to Juliet. Which qualities you're transferring, what you're kind of dragging over, that's going to be something to be settled. Note that in order to kind of get this, we implicitly need to get a grip on this literal figurative distinction. And this is really hard. Right? Exactly how to understand a literal figurative distinction is difficult, but we can tell what the literal and figurative difference is if you can tell the difference between this picture and this picture. Right? It's basically running with the same joke, right? Juliet is the sun, as in, this is now going to be a kind of segue into expressing how wonderful Lovely has the center of his universe, blah, 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 versus, oh my God, she's a giant ball of flaming gas and we're all melting, right? This would be the literal version versus the figurative version, right? Again, I don't have an easy way to cash that distinction out, but I feel like you've got a grip on it. Right? Note, if you already understand cash that out, which is a metaphor, you've got the sense of figurative language versus me paying you. Don't smile like that. I'm not paying you. Damn. So, okay, metaphors are a way of using figurative language. They're not the only way. There's going to be lots. Puns are going to be involved here. Other things too. But we're just going to talk about metaphor. How do metaphors work? Well, again, there's a kind of likening or comparing or analogizing a primary and a secondary subject. So in Juliet is the sun, our primary subject is Juliet. Our secondary one is the sun. And again, there's some kind of inheritance for Juliet of relevant qualities. Notably, they don't even have to actually be qualities that the sun has. Right? It might be stuff that the sun is taken to have, or is sometimes thought to have, or even that the sun figuratively itself has. So this process is super weird, right? And very, very, very flexible. It's also worth noting that this description doesn't work for every kind of metaphor. Just to give you an example, the very beginning of, I believe, the Odyssey talks about rosy-fingered dawn.
Yeah,
I couldn't remember.
saying it all the time.
Yeah, I just couldn't remember if it was the Iliad or the Odyssey. It's one of those two.
It's both homework.
Okay.
We're reading it now for an hour.
Okay.
Rosie Finger dodged just every page. Every time some comes up.
But no, this is metaphorical, right? But it's not going to map onto this kind of comparison. It's not an A is F, right? This is somehow a different structure, but you can see, hopefully, a similar kind of structure or transference going on, right? We're treating dawn as if it's the kind of thing that has fingers, and the rosiness here, well, that's also metaphorical, possibly. Maybe it's a direct similarity comparison about color. Another one, plowing through the discussion. Right? Again, it's metaphorical, and there is not even any kind of description or ascription here. It's just telling us the sort of verb that we're engaging with and using a slightly different one to help us get a grip on something else, right? Getting a grip on how we're just kind of pushing through even if the discussion is difficult. Yeah?
I wonder that is the reason that we solely focus on the subjects, Juliet and the son, and exclude the is the and the predicate like fingered, truly,
These ones, yeah.
because we're now focusing solely on semantics and not the pragmatics?
Yeah, good. So I think one reason to start with these ones, right, this kind of comparison case, is it's going to be easier to get a grip on grammatically.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very hard to figure out what even the subject of this kind of claim is and how we're treating the qualities being ascribed, what qualities are being ascribed. Whereas this one, at least, we've got a grip. We've got her, and we kind of have a grip on what qualities we want to ascribe to her via the metaphor.
Yeah, okay, but the words in between the two subjects don't have anything to do with the metaphor. Like
Oh,
the
no,
whole.
no. In this case, they do, right? So
Yeah.
importantly, right, the is telling us that Juliet has these properties, or she is identical to in this case, right? And the son is just a way for us to, again, this is the definite article.
Yeah, yeah.
So it would be fine if we just erase that and capitalize the S instead.
Ah, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. So again, there's this kind of likening, comparing, analogizing. You get what's often called a perspectival theory. Perspectival theory is a way to understand what's going on with these metaphors, right? So Kite talks about this. This is the function that metaphor serves to provide a perspective from which to gain an understanding of that which is metaphorically portrayed. There's a lot of whiches there, but hopefully it makes sense, right? What does the metaphor do? It gives you a perspective on the original source, the original object, that's been colored by the description you used in the second object, right? So we're thinking about Juliet via the perspective of this heavenly body. What's interesting about this kind of perspectival understanding of how metaphors work is that it makes it explicitly cognitive. It's something that we have to do. It's something we're thinking. It's contentful. There's something being learned. A perspective is being gained and then used in the thought process. Notably, though, whatever's going on, nothing here explicitly says that the content is novel or distinct or special to the metaphor. Okay. Now,
What does it mean? Why not novel?
good. So it might be giving us a perspective that we could have gotten, right, in the exact same way if we just would have used a bunch of literal language. Right? We could have, instead of using the figurative thing to give us the perspective, I could have just described the various qualities that Juliet has directly. At least in principle, right? Nothing about this kind of understanding of what a metaphor does or how it works forces us to say what the metaphor is delivering couldn't be delivered any other way. That's the important thing. It's compatible with it being novel. It's also compatible with it not being novel. It might be epistemically or pragmatically useful, not semantically ineliminable. Okay. So this takes us to a second kind of question we can ask, right? What, if anything, does a metaphor say? Right? Or put another way, to pick our particular example, what is the semantic content of Juliet is the sun? So here we're explicitly trying to ask, like, what does it say? What's the meaning being delivered? Right? Or to go back, right? What's the kind of stuff that we're going to be learning here? Right? And it's worth noting that whatever answer we're going to give to this, right, about what the content is, should probably also explain that function, the perspectival kind of characterization or the analogous function, right? Because if it doesn't, if it just says there is no content, we have one really weird thing. How is it that we can use metaphor in this way? If metaphor doesn't deliver anything, what the hell is going on when we do this?
You could paraphrase reality, kind of.
Good, but note, in that case, the metaphor still delivers content. It's just not new content. It's the same stuff we could have said with literal language, right? So the trick is, right, what's the content? And then there's another question. If it does have content, is it something new? Something different from what we would have gotten with a literal language? Does that make sense? Does everybody see the kind of difference there? So here's a really quick and dirty response, right? It's a reductionist response. And this is Davidson's view. Davidson says metaphors don't mean anything over and above what the language used normally means. Right? So Juliet is the sun really does literally mean Juliet stands in the identity relation to that giant ball of flaming gas. As Davidson says, metaphors mean what the words in their most literal interpretation mean and nothing more. Right?
So that would mean that within natural language you could convey the same things.
So importantly, all of this is natural language with literal language, right?
Yeah.
So we could sit there, when I say Juliet is the sun, and I'm trying to convey things like, oh, she's the center of my universe. She's warm and lovely. She's the reason for me to get up in the morning. She makes my day wonderful. Cool. I could have just said that, right? Instead of saying she's the sun. Right? And according to this view, right, the content of my assertion, when I say Juliet is the sun, is that she stands in the identity relation to that thing.
But did he really, then he never reads a book or something? Right?
Cool.
Because he doesn't.
So here's what he's going to say, right? And this is the second part. The content here is literally what's said. Right? Juliet is identical to that thing. But what the expression, what the utterance does, is it invites you to attend to some likeness. But this invitation is not the meaning. The meaning is she is that thing. She stands in the. So it's kind of like this. The actual content of the utterance is obviously false. Because
if you take it literally.
If you take it,
obviously, yeah.
and this is the only way that he's going to say the content is this. It is a literal claim. It's silly.
Yeah, obviously.
But by uttering this obviously false, silly thing, there's an invitation to perhaps imagine, to suppose, not to believe, not to anything like that. Don't take it as true, but to attend to some possible similarity relation. How is Juliet like this thing? Well, okay, I guess she's warm. I guess that if I spend too much time with her, I start to feel sick and need a drink of water, right? Okay, you see the jokes, right?
Well, it's very subjective. I mean, in the paper, she explains what she thinks by Juliet is the son, and anything what she said, it's not in my interpretation of her metaphor. It was
Nice.
completely different.
Good. So note,
It's
again,
very subjective.
at this point, what we're really interested in, these very, very broad kind of church options with regards to the content of the metaphors. She didn't really even talk about this position, frankly. So this is a position that's just like, no, the language literally just means what it always literally means. And anything else that you think you're getting here is something like an invitation to make believe. Again, and that's not explicitly what Davidson thinks it is, but we can read it in that sort of way. I am not asserting that she is these qualities or has these qualities. I'm asserting that she is identical to a giant celestial object, but I'm inviting you via that assertion, right? I'm making...
Pejoratively.
Not even necessarily pejoratively, right? Because I'm not inviting her to like be denigrated in these kinds of things. What really we're doing effectively is performing a kind of speech act, right? The speech act here consists of uttering this thing directly, literally, but in doing the speech act, there's an invitation to pay attention to, imagine, suppose these similarities. So in this case, according to this reductionist view, it isn't metaphorical meaning that allows us to understand a metaphor. Rather, the act of interpretation is itself a work of imagination. Right? So the content of the metaphor is the literal content, what these words literally mean. The way that we get the perspective isn't part of the semantic content. It's part of something like a speech act that's being done with the expression of this content. It's a heavy view, right?
What's the difference? I mean, in the end, it's all part of the meaning.
Good.
The author of the sentences, Juliet is like the sun,
Good.
wants to convey a certain meaning.
So remember when we were talking about Bryce, talk about the kind of non-natural meaning of an expression. We can talk about what making an utterance says in a very broad sense. So the non-natural meaning is going to be this very strict semantic content. Then the rest of it might be whatever we can do with it. When you said pejorative, you were thinking of not pejorative in the sense of like denigrating somebody.
No, that perhaps it means something slightly different.
Yes. So again, to get clear, right? We can think about this. The semantic content of get out is very hard to pin down, but the kind of broad meaning of it, in this very, very broad sense of what is said, is a kind of command to leave. Same thing too, of like, if you ask me how I'm feeling, and I say, oh, I'm living, right? The semantic content is literally just that I am alive. But what's being conveyed in a very broad sense is I'm alive, things could be a hell of a lot better, I'm getting through, right? Importantly, what we're focusing on here is just that semantic content, the meaning, not necessarily everything else that's going on around it. Because there's a really silly view, which I didn't even bother to put on here, is that it's the literal meaning and nothing else happens. Right? And this is such a silly view because it immediately runs into this. How can we learn anything using a metaphor? That ultra-reductionist view it's just got to be off the table, right? Or you go, oh, we never learn from metaphor, which is a move, right? So this reductionist view says the semantic content of the metaphor, right, what it strictly says in the strictest sense, is just the usual literal semantic content, but you can do more with it in this very broad way. The next one along is a kind of similar view. Right? So the next one along kind of adopts what you were just saying. Right? It says, right, Juliet is the sun. The semantic value, the semantic content is the same as the literal content. But in a much broader sense, what is said includes something novel, some kind of content that is not being conveyed otherwise. So again, what we have here is effectively something like a Gricean implicature conveying additional propositions, additional semantic content that wasn't just in the literal expression. So the difference between this view and the one before is that even in that kind of pragmatic aspect of the utterance, there isn't new stuff being conveyed. It's maybe getting you to make believe it or something like this. Here, genuinely novel stuff is being conveyed. There's a sense of metaphorical meaning, but it's not in the semantics of the metaphor. It is in the pragmatic aspects of the metaphor. So it's not coming in as part of the actual semantic content of the expression. It's coming in something like the implicature. And I just got a quote from Barfield here. Barfield is someone who adopts a view that's broadly along these lines. Right?
Is it kind of the same with Quine? That you have so you say, so there is a fact, and because you say something in correlation with that fact, it is seen as something new, because it is in correlation with the fact.
Kind of. So what maybe is better, the reductionist says you never say anything new, you never deliver new content, but you might get people to do stuff. The second one says, strictly speaking, you don't say anything new, but you convey something new. It's not part of what I've explicitly said, but it's part of what I'm saying in a very broad sense. Again, when I say I'm living in response to how are you doing, strictly speaking, it's just I'm living. It conveys, implicature-wise, that things could be better and things could be worse. So that's that pragmatic element doing the carrying. And the last view, which again, just to give it a name, we'll call a realist, we might even call this a metaphoricalist, right, is that metaphors themselves, their actual content, right, not in the pragmatics, but at the level of semantics, generates, there's the word I'm looking for, generates genuinely novel metaphorical meaning. So that is, when I use Juliet is the sun, I'm actually literally saying something new. The propositions I'm conveying, or the proposition I am conveying with that sentence, is new. It is different than what I would have said with some other expression. Yeah.
So new in the sense that it can't be said with words, or new in the sense that it's not just a little word?
Well, I mean, it can be said with words, because I'm saying it with words. But the thought is, it isn't something that was said with literal words. Right?
So so something other than the literal words.
Mm-hmm.
Just that's because that's also, yeah.
The key difference between the three positions. Everybody agrees that metaphors are doing something. It's basically placing where the something is, right? The reductionist places it, if you like, in the speech acts that are done with the utterance. The semantics remains the same as if I had just said something really stupid, right? When I say Juliet is the sun. Our pragmatics person says, okay, semantically, Juliet is the sun is a really weird thing to say, but in the utterance, you also convey via implicature a bunch of content that you didn't otherwise, and that implicature carries novel content. And the novel content, maybe it's something we could explicate using literal language, maybe not. Again, up for grabs. But that novel content is coming in at that level of implicature. Finally, our realist, right? The new stuff is coming in literally at the level of the semantics. What you are literally saying when you utter Juliet is the sun is a different proposition, or conveys a different proposition than if you sat there and listed off all of the qualities that you want to say that she has. That's the thought here. So how does it do this? Well, I meant to put the citation. This is from Richard Morin. So the idea is that the language introduces a kind of tension between what we can call focal phrases and framing phrases. So Juliet is going to be the frame. That is, right, she's kind of there in the object we're taking. Then the focal phrase will be, is the sun. Right? And clearly that's silly. If we read this literally, then we're saying again that she is this celestial body. So the tension here needs to be resolved. The way we resolve it is by altering the meaning of is the sun. So instead of having its usual meaning, its literal meaning, we ascribe to it novel metaphorical meaning. So the frame, if you like, causes the focal phrases to shift in meaning. You sometimes see this is called like the semantic twist account, which I hate. But again, the broad idea is that this tension between the object that you're ascribing the property to and the framing that you're using, or the phrase you're using, I should say the focus that you're using, right, gives you a tension. You have to reinterpret the focal phrases to make it make sense. And reinterpret here isn't just literally like play around with it. It is ascribe new meaning to this phrase. Okay, I'm going too slow.
I find it hard to distinguish between the three.
Good.
They seem to boil down to about the same thing for me.
So the difference here is, again, where we're kind of getting the function and where if there's any new stuff, where it might come in, right? You can think about it this way. This view says metaphors literally say something you couldn't say using literal language. Because there's this new metaphorical content. That
Couldn't you say you didn't say? Because
couldn't. Well, potentially couldn't, right? This is something we're going to talk about. Right? This is the next bit. Right? But really flat-footedly, we can read them this way, right? Let's take the realist in its full-blown sense. The metaphors say something you could not say literally. That's one way to go, right? Juliet is the sun. What does this mean, according to these guys? Something new. Something that could not be expressed using any other way. Yeah, we can massage that, but this is a kind of version of this kind of view. Okay? Now to go back, the pragmatist says, no, right? When you say Juliet is the sun, the actual content, what you say there, is stupid, silly, and false. You're identifying a woman with a giant ball of gas. Right? But you're still conveying some content, but it's not in the semantics. It is in the pragmatics. In the same way, right, that when I say I'm living, it's not part of the semantics of my claim that I could be better. It's part of what I'm saying in the very broad sense. It's the pragmatic aspect that's doing the job. That's the idea here. So it's not at the semantic level, it's at the pragmatic level. And then finally, our reductionist semantic level is the same as the pragmatic guy. When you say Juliet is the sun, you're saying something really silly. She's identifying with this heavenly body. Right? The pragmatics are the same as usual. Why are you saying this? It's very weird. It's creepy. Instead, what's happening is that there's something like a speech act being performed, inviting you to draw on some similarities. So it's not at the level of semantics, it's not at the level of pragmatics, it's something more like a speech act that's being performed, and at no point do you get new content. Right? So you can kind of think about them in that way, right? There's, if you like, two camps. The pragmatist, as I put them, and the realist both think metaphors deliver new content. They differ about what the vehicle for delivering that is. Semantic claim for the realist, pragmatics for the pragmatist. The reductionist here says nothing new under the sun. At best, it's just a kind of invitation to imagine. It is subtle, but it's important that we can kind of tease those differences out.
So you could say that the realist metaphor has like a world on its, a reality on its own.
In a sense, right?
In a sense.
It's giving you some content. Again, we can call it, let's put it in the really strong terms, right? It's giving you content you could not get otherwise. Again, there'll be weaker versions of the view, but we can stick with that. So this leads us, those views lead us to this question of what's the relationship between figurative and literal language? There's a sense in which literal language does have to have a privileged theoretical place, because we will use literal language to articulate the figurative cases. But is it semantically privileged? That is, put another way, can what is expressed with a metaphor always be cashed out in literal language? Can we capture the content of a metaphor with paraphrase? Put another way, are metaphors semantically eliminable? Now, the interesting thing here, right, to go back to the views we just talked about, reductionists are obviously going to say yes. Pragmatists can also say yes. Because what they could say is that the way you're delivering it is useful, this kind of implicature version, but you could have just said it directly. Realists, at least as we're construing them here, can't. They're going to have to say that metaphors deliver something new that the paraphrase can't capture. And to stress, the challenge is here not whether metaphors are epistemically useful or pragmatically useful, not in the pragmatic sense that I had a second ago, but useful for us to get around in the world, right? Because that's obviously the case. It's, are they semantically useful? Right? Could we get rid of them? Could we re-express everything metaphorical in literal terms? So, we've got two long quotes, and we'll go through them very quickly. Forgot. In between, quick, dirty thing about paraphrase. What's going to count as a good paraphrase? Because we're going to have to say something about that. To go back a slide, right? Can we paraphrase the metaphor into literal language? So remember, to paraphrase is to say something in a different way. Say the same thing using a different collection of words. Changing the expression without changing the semantic content.
Semantic content, I suppose you mean the propositions within a sentence?
Propositions expressed.
Yeah. Okay.
Changing the words, have the same proposition. So what do we need to do for an adequate paraphrase? And here we can just take some things from Kant, right? Whatever an adequate paraphrase needs to do, it needs to have what we'll call the same truth conditions. It needs to capture all and only the same propositions as our original expression. So it shouldn't say too much, include stuff that the original didn't, and it shouldn't say too little. It needs to say everything that the original did. And to quote Kant, it should enable an otherwise linguistically competent speaker to understand the original utterance's content simply in virtue of understanding the meaning of the paraphrase's sentence's constituent terms and their mode of combination. So what does this mean? If you get the paraphrase, you should be able to understand what the metaphor said. You should be able to go back and forth between the two if you're a competent speaker and you understand the mode of composition. So, will metaphors be paraphrasable into literal language? Here's a quick and dirty assertion that yes. This is from Stanley Cavell, right? Suppose I'm asked what someone means who says Juliet is the sun. I may say something like, Romeo means that Juliet is the warmth of his world, that his day begins with her, that only in her nourishment can he grow. His declaration suggests that the moon, which other lovers use as an emblem of their love, is merely her reflected light, and dead in comparison, and so on. In a word, I paraphrase it. Moreover, if I could not provide an explanation of this form, that's a very good reason, a perfect reason, for supposing that I do not know what it being the metaphor, means. Metaphor is paraphrasable. And there's something really plausible about Cavell's line here, right? Especially that last little bit here. It's a kind of version of the argument I gave you before. What was the meaning that this thing delivered? If you can articulate it, cool, then you've articulated in literal language. If you can't articulate it, then you should probably doubt that there was actually anything there to begin with. Cavell's version of the same argument I gave you earlier.
And then she stands within which position? The pragmatist? Realist?
So Cavell is going to eventually be a kind of realist. But so this is this metaphorical thing, right? Okay, metaphors look paraphrasable. Now I'm not going to go through the long black quote because this was also in the camp. So we're just going to jump through fast. We have an argument, though, from Black to say metaphors are not paraphrasable. Right? And basically, Black gives us three reasons. So again, this was in the camp, so I'm not going to spend long on it. The three reasons Black cites. First, paraphrase is going to kind of level out the content being delivered. So the thought is that, right, if you do the literal expression, like Cavell did a second ago, what it's not giving you is a kind of priority relation. You could. We're going to come to that, right? Interestingly, it's not clear if even the description of the like, oh, this is the really important one and this is the weaker one, is going to have the same kind of weighting. Again, something we can kind of lean on. Right? So we lose track of the importance. I think these are the better points. The second point Black talks about is that a paraphrase says too much. And arguably it says both too much and too little. Because when we do the paraphrase and we get this long list of literal assertions, it's going to be very specific, very definitive, very explicit. But the metaphor, in a sense, is fuzzy. It isn't specific. It isn't really definitive. That's part of the value of the metaphor. You might think. Yeah.
There's something going on with because when you say Juliet is a son, we might think of all kinds of things you may mean with it that you completely didn't thought about at all. So in what sense then is it still a language that you try to convey something to me, if I can read anything into it at all?
Good. So remember way back, we're always talking about speaker meaning here, and speaker meaning and in trying to express does not entail understanding. So there can be a failure of the communication in the sense of like,
because your speaker meaning will be finite, so then expressible, right? So there might be all those infinite things to find in a metaphor, and if you don't mean them, then why are we?
Well, so here's the interesting thing, right? If you think that the metaphor really does express some new content, it will be finite content, but it could be kind of infinitely deep, as it were, in that when you try and draw out what all the entailments of that metaphorical content are, it could just go on for forever.
Then you would have to think infinite things at the moment that you're uttering it.
Well, no,
Sounds so weird.
because all you need to be able to think or express or latch onto the metaphorical proposition. Because we don't think every logical consequence of the stuff that we do. Otherwise, many of us would be thinking everything all at once. Right?
Like the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So again, there's a sense in which if we do the literal symbolization or the literal expression, we're going to have maybe too much, maybe too little. And finally, and this is an interesting one, right? The paraphrase is going to fail the perspectival test. Remember where we started, what metaphors are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be delivering these kinds of perspectives. If we do the literal paraphrase, it's not going to, says Black, deliver the relevant kind of perspective. It's just going to give you a list of propositions, not the perspective. Now, there's ways to push back on all of these, right? And Camp kind of talks through them. In particular, mentions the first one. The first one we can push back on very helpfully. He says, look at figure 1. We could always do this. The heaviness of the boxes orders the importance. And it's like, this is better than a metaphor.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting is if this is what we have to do in order to capture the metaphorical content, we might be back in interesting questions about expressibility, pictorial representation, and literal representation or linguistic representation. Remember that questions we had earlier about like expressibility and meaningfulness. But more generally, right, these ones seem, at least in some sense, plausible. But note, there are ways to push back on both of these. The first one, and we'll wrap up with this, I'm sorry I'm a little bit late, right? If we think about the saying too much and too little, the Cavell quote I read earlier, there was a very important clause about the and so on. Cavell says that and so on registers what Empson called the pregnancy of metaphors, the burgeoning of meaning in them. The overreading of metaphors, so often complained of, no doubt justly, is a hazard that they must run for their high interest. So the thought here is, okay, it seems like there's too much or possibly too little semantic content in the relation to our literal expression, but that's just part of the way that we engage with these things. That's why they're interesting. Doesn't mean that they're semantically distinct. This is back on maybe it's something pragmatic. Maybe it's interesting in that kind of invitation to make believe sense. Because an invitation to make believe is going to be more interesting than this literal list. And finally, on the perspectival part, again, to push back on this idea that there's genuinely metaphorical content that's special. Is the insight, is the perspective really semantic? Or is that not just epistemic and pragmatic? Is that not just saying that maybe the value of the metaphor is an epistemic thing? It helps us get certain perspectives that are really hard to get to with the literal description, but that says something about the way we get perspectives rather than the semantic content being novel. Okay. So, sorry, I meant to leave some time to talk about camp explicitly, but my bad timing. But the things to take away here, right? There's a very broad question about the relationship between expressibility and meaning. That was the stuff we talked about in the first half. And there's an interesting, I think, question to be asked about that relationship. Is everything that's meaningful, can it be expressed in language? In some sense it can. Reasons to think yes, reasons to think no. Then with regards to metaphor, I tried to articulate these three positions about what we might think of as, do metaphors deliver content? And if they do they deliver novel content? Reductionist says no. Pragmatist broadly says no, but they can say yes if pressed, being delivered in the sort of in the pragmatic way. And our realist can be read as saying yes. So that was the kind of things I wanted to get through. What we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about basically different ways that we're all doing it wrong. So we're going to try and pull apart lying, error, nonsense, and bullshit. And the reading for next week is a whole book. It's a very short book. It's like 30 pages, right? It's Frankfurt's on bullshit. Have you guys read it already? Is this something that people have assigned for other classes? That's weird. I would have thought maybe. It's really fun. It's an interesting little book. The PDF link should work. If not, let me know and I'll find another one. Have a read over it. Take care. Have a lovely, lovely weekend. And we'll see you guys all next week.
I found another picture of him in the month I did. If you see